I'm MJ Wright from the Wayland Public Library and love local history. And so we've been trying to set up programs about Wayland. And of course, Rick Conard is the kind of expert in residence on the railroad here because he's lived here all his life. And he wrote his first paper, I think, in high school on the railroad and just fell in love with the railroad. And now he's been collecting memorabilia and all kinds of stuff about the local the Wayland Railroad. And so that he's got an exhibit called Wayland Railroadiana. That's at the library right now. So with that, I'm just going to welcome you to speak. Oh, we have to, and the Historical Society, because we're co-sponsoring. So.
Hi, everybody. I'm Scarlett Hoey. I'm the new executive director at the Wayland Museum and Historical Society, the Grout Herd House, Constituent. We're so excited to be partnering with our friends at the library. Very excited for Rick's talk tonight. If you ever want to see Rick's paper that he wrote, we have it in our files. So with that, thank you so much, Rick.
Okay. Thank you all very much for coming. I hope my voice holds up. I hope you can hear me. If not, let me know, raise your hand, and I hope the people out there on Zoom can hear me as well. Courtney, thank you very much for designing the title slide, and MJ for inviting me to give this talk. The last time I gave a talk on the railroad was at the Wayland Historical Society's museum, the Grout Herd House, in 2018. And that talk focused pretty much just on Wayland. I called it Wayland's Railroad. And this talk, I thought I would expand out a little bit more to talk about the entire railroad line that ran between Boston and Northampton through Wayland. So I changed the title. A few of the slides are ones that I used in 2018, but I've made a lot of additional changes and things. So I hope if anybody remembers that program, they'll see some new stuff. So I thought I would elaborate a little bit more on this title slide, which is a photo by Alfred Wayland Cutting, who was one of Wayland's prominent photographers. And if Jane Siaka, I believe she's on Zoom, she may remember that a few years ago, after this photo was posted to Digital Commonwealth, the year Digital Commonwealth changed it to 1892, and that didn't agree with the information that I had from the Historical Society. So Jane checked the original print at the Wayland Museum, the Grout Herd House, and found that it was 1882. It's 10 years earlier. So that got corrected on Digital Commonwealth. So this photo was taken about a little less than a year after the railroad opened in Wayland. And you see the 1878 town hall on the left, which is where the Grout Herd House, Wayland Historical Society's museum, is today. So you might want to know how did I become interested in the railroad in Wayland? Well, I went through Wayland High School, and my US history teacher was Robert Scotland. And I think a few people in the audience remember Mr. Scotland. This is a photo from my high school yearbook. And as you can see, he had a tendency to sometimes put students to sleep when he read his yellowed notes year after year. But actually, I enjoyed US history, and especially, well, I enjoyed US history more than Mrs. Champagne's European history course that I took a year earlier. So Mr. Scotland asked every student to write a research paper. on a topic of our choosing. So I had ridden the train to Boston on a number of occasions. I lived near the railroad and I could watch the freight train go by. I had some fellow students in high school that were also interested in the railroad and in model railroading. So I told Mr. Scotland that I was interested in writing a paper on the history of the railroad in Wayland. So he said, well, that's a good idea, but I don't think you'll be able to find enough information on the railroad. So why don't you expand it to include the stagecoach and the trolley in Wayland? So I reluctantly agreed. And I couldn't find much information on the stagecoach at all. I found more on the inns and taverns that stagecoach travelers allegedly stopped at through the Boston Post Road and Boston Worcester Turnpike, which is now Route 9. And I couldn't find any primary source information on stagecoaches. So my section of my paper on stagecoaches was very short, but I visited the Wayland Historical Society and Emily Blair was the curator at the time, and she was thrilled that a local student was interested in local history. So she was very helpful to me in providing information from the Historical Society's files on the trolley and the railroad. And I also visited of course, the Wayland Public Library. And there was a lady there, I believe her name was Mary Howard. Does that name sound familiar to anyone who worked for the library? And suggested that I ought to go visit Charlie Cole, who was the retired station agent in Wayland, living on Boston Post Road, right across from the post office. So Charlie was well into his 80s and pretty much bedridden as the result of an injury that he had suffered a few years earlier. But Charlie Cole had saved all sorts of information about the railroad, photographs, timetables, paper memorabilia, and he told me a lot of stories about the railroad. And he was really a wealth of information that really helped me in my paper that I called Wayland from Stage to Rail. And I'm glad to learn the Historical Society has a copy of that paper. A few months after my paper, the Wayland Weston Town Crier published an issue on transportation history in Wayland and Weston, 1969. And they published a portion of my paper in this issue. The following week appeared a letter to the editor from James Bolton, who had said he worked as an assistant to Frank Hausland, the station agent, in 1907 at the station. But the article, the letter to the editor, didn't have an address. So I visited the offices of the town crier, which at that time were where CVS is now. Does anybody remember Caraway's restaurant that was on the same site? Yeah. Well, the town crier offices were in that same building, I think before Caraway's restaurant and sandwich shop. So I inquired there, and they told me that Mr. Bolton had written a great big long letter, and they'd only published a short portion of it in their letters to the editor. So I said, well, do you have the rest of his article? Oh, no, we threw it away.
Oh,
So they did have Mr. Bolton's address, and I wrote him, T-ticket, Massachusetts, in Falmouth. And fortunately, he had saved a carbon copy of his letter. Anybody remember carbon copies? Which he sent to me, which was a little hard to read, so I retyped it. And I engaged in some correspondence back and forth with James Bolton. I asked him some questions and he replied, and the Historical Society has a copy of James Bolton's manuscript. Moving on with the history of the railroad, one of the most important people in Wayland associated with the railroad was James Sumner Draper, who was more or less the unofficial town historian. And he was an early promoter of the railroad. He lived on Plain Road in the cluster of Draper houses near Tower Hill Station. He wrote letters to the editor, to various people urging construction of the railroad, and he later became an officer and director of the Massachusetts Central Railroad. In 1868, the Massachusetts legislature chartered the Wayland and Sudbury Branch Railroad to run from a connection with the Fitchburg Railroad, which is today's MBTA Fitchburg commuter rail line, in Weston, near the location, the present day location of Kendall Green Station, to go through Weston, Wayland, and Sudbury. But the following year, towns to the west of Sudbury decided that they wanted improved transportation as well. So the legislature chartered the Massachusetts Central Railroad that would take over the charter of the Wayland and Sudbury branch and build a railroad line west to Northampton. At that time, the connection was still proposed to be with the Fitchburg Railroad in Weston. However, the Fitchburg Railroad wasn't interested in connecting with a competitive line across Massachusetts. And they weren't particularly interested in branches. So in 1872, the Massachusetts Central Railroad reached an agreement with the Boston and Lowell Railroad to establish a connection over part of the Boston and Lowell's line into Boston. So saving the Massachusetts Central the expense of building a railroad line all the way into Boston. And through parts of Waltham and through Belmont, the Massachusetts Central built its line right next to the Fitchburg Railroad. And then it veered off in Cambridge. So throughout the 1870s, the Massachusetts Central Railroad was raising money, surveying the route, and purchasing land and starting to grade the roadbed in preparation for laying track. However, in 1873, there was a panic of 1873. They didn't call them recessions or depressions back then. They called them panics because they were largely Wall Street initiated events. So that stopped some of the construction in the 1870s. Can anyone tell me what these lines represent? You're better now?
The Fitchburg line and the Mass Central line.
Okay, well, the red line is the Mass Central line. Does this help? Can you hear better now with this microphone?
Yes.
So the blue line is the present day route of Boston Post Road, Route 20. And I'm not showing the profile, the vertical elevation, but you know how Route 20 goes up and down hills and around curves. But the surveyors that surveyed the Massachusetts Central Railroad just drew a straight line from the Weston Town Line to the Sudbury Town Line. And most of that land was undeveloped farmland at the time. And that was the route that they chose. So there were no curves at all in Wayland for the route. So purchasing the land. The Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society archives has a collection of over 40,000 file cards that were donated by the railroad to the B&M Railroad Historical Society about 35 years ago. Each card represents a parcel of land that was purchased by the railroad, including predecessor railroads, like the Mass Central. And they're in order by grantor, which is the person or entity that sold the land to the railroad. And this is an example of one of the showing land that was purchased by the Massachusetts Central Railroad from Hodijah Raymond. And if I'm mispronouncing Hodijah, Sherry Ann, the president of the Wayland Historical Society, will let me know. So this is 1873, when the railroad purchased the land. If my calculations are correct from the Val plans, this was a parcel of land about 4.3 acres. And the railroad typically purchased the right of way width was 5 rods, which translates to, what's that, 82.5 feet. That was the typical width that they purchased. And this is one of 13 recorded parcels of land that the Massachusetts Central Railroad purchased in Wayland between 1872 and 1880. They did purchase some additional land after that, but the railroad did not obtain a temporary easement. They actually purchased the land outright. They didn't have land grants like was the case with the first transcontinental railroad, and they didn't have the power of eminent domain to acquire the land and then settle afterwards. They actually purchased the land outright. This is the house that Hodijah Raymond lived in. He was a pretty wealthy landowner in Wayland. The house was demolished in 1980, but do you recognize the pillars? Yes. The pillars remain, and the house is now the site of Wayland Commons on Hastings Way. Hastings was a later owner of the property from Hodijah Raymond. There was also a large barn behind the house, and that was all farmland and a hillside where Raytheon was built in the 1950s, if you remember Raytheon. So he was a pretty well-to-do merchant in the furniture and upholstery business in Boston, and he was another strong supporter of the railroad. You can find some of the same information in those file cards if you go to the Registry of Deeds, if you have the time to look. But there's Hodijah Raymond, there's the $1,000 that the railroad paid for his land. And it says he was apparently a resident of Newton. So maybe he lived in Newton as well as Wayland, or maybe he owned land in Newton. So building the railroad. This is a poster from what we know, a lot of Irish immigrants were hired to build the railroad. And $1.75 per day. Steady employment, it says. This was in the town of West Rutland in 1872. The primary contractor for building the railroad was Norman C. Munson. And there's a picture of him on the right. This is the only picture that we have found showing anything close to the construction of the railroad. This picture was taken in South Sudbury. Picture from the Sudbury Historical Society's collection, showing one of the engines that Norman Munson owned, along with a bunch of four-wheel side dump carts that were used for hauling gravel. One of Norman Munson's other claims to fame was that he and George Goss were partners in filling in the Back Bay in Boston, which was a huge project of hauling gravel, mostly from Needham, but also from other places, to fill in the mud flats that were in the Back Bay. And from the 1850s to the 1880s, there were gravel trains that ran 24 hours a day, 24 trains per day, hauling gravel between Needham and other places to fill in the Back Bay. And Norman Munson was one of the two contractors that did that work. And Munson and his partner were paid whenever house lots were created from filling in the land, from 25% of the value of the land that was sold. So Norman Munson had a lot of experience in building railroads and hauling gravel. In 1880, the first rails were laid at South Sudbury for the railroad after the embankment had been built. And the first train operated on October 1st, 1881, and the Wayland Historical Society. This is an image of the Wayland Historical Society's ticket for the first day of operation. And the ticket on the back was signed by H.C. Damon and K. Westcott. K. Gardner Westcott found that was probably Harriet Coburn Damon that had signed the back of the ticket. So October 1st, 1881 was a big celebration with an inaugural train, guests and speeches, and it said in the history that there was a cannon salute fired from Bremen Hill by Hodijah Bremen. And when the train reached Hudson, there was a brass band and a procession to Hudson Town Hall for a dinner with speeches. Remember that Mr. Scotland, my high school teacher, said, "I don't think you'll find that much information on the railroad." But this is a letter that Kay Gardner Westcott showed me last week from the Historical Society's collection that I had never seen before. I had seen the ticket, but not the invitation. And this is to Mr. Isaac Damon, who I assume was the husband of Harriet, inviting them to ride on the inaugural train. Here is the menu for the dinner at Hudson Town Hall. Scalloped oysters, cold ham, cold chicken, cold tongue. I guess that was the menu of the day back then. And presumably there were a lot of speeches. by the officials.
Excuse me, can I ask you just a quick question?
Sure.
So we saw a straight line, right? Going
Yep.
out through, was Hudson, was that used to be Marlboro when that happened, or why, how did it get up to Hudson?
It was, the town was Hudson at that time in eighteen
But it's the
eighty-one.
but it's what we now call Marlboro? Or not? I mean, 'cause if you go
No.
straight, if you go straight
Hudson
line
is
through
north of
Sudbury, you
Marlboro.
don't go anywhere near Hudson, right?
Let's see, I'm confused by your reference
I
to
think he's wondering
Marlboro.
the direction, so it cuts straight through Wayland, but then it curves and eventually it goes to Hudson. So
Right.
the line curves.
So
Right.
after South Sudbury, it did the line curve and went up north?
It went through Hudson.
Okay.
It didn't curve too much. Marlboro is south of Hudson,
Right,
Okay.
so
They're
it
adjacent.
went pretty much straight across to Hudson. I'll show a map in a minute,
Great, thank
which
you.
might help.
Sorry.
But there's Hudson Town Hall on the right, which is a building that still survives today. It was renovated a couple of years ago by the town. And the building on the left is from an image from the menu on that opening day, showing the Boston and Lowell Railroad Station on Causeway Street. And that is the present day site of the Thomas P. O'Neill Federal Office Building on the corner of Causeway and Nashua Streets. It's very interesting that what a coincidence in architectural style of the two buildings. I guess that was the style back then. Popular style. This is the only photograph that we have found showing an engine lettered for the Massachusetts Central Railroad. This was a brand new engine purchased by the Mass Central. They had about 4 or 5 engines. Several were new, others were used. Some were obtained from the contractor Norman C. Munson. And this is a timetable for the Mass Central, kind of tattered, but 1882 timetable showing that same image of the Boston and Lowell Station in Boston. This is the route of the Mass Central Railroad. Opening day, they only ran between Boston and Hudson, but within another year, they extended the railroad line to a little village called Jefferson's, which is in the town of Holden, northwest of Worcester. And that's about as far as the Mass Central reached. The route shows their projected route to Northampton. So I think you can see Hudson on there. The map is a little bit stylized, but Hudson is pretty much directly west of Sudbury.
in the eastern part of Hudson, the branch from South Acton on the Fitchburg that went to Marlboro
Yep.
crosses,
Right,
not at grade, the Mass Central that is going directly west, more or less directly west to Hudson.
right. Well, that's another reason why the Fitchburg Railroad was not so enthusiastic about the Mass Central, because it would have drawn traffic away from their branch between Marlboro and Hudson and South Acton that continued on to Boston. This is an image that I found in the Lincoln Town Archives. This is in Weston. It's not in Wayland because you can see a curve in the distance, and we know that there were no curves on the railroad in Wayland. This was the photographer is unknown, but this was taken evidently right after the railroad opened. And you can see the rural nature of the landscape at that time, which was mostly farmland. When the railroad was built, they had to build fences alongside the railroad to prevent cattle from wandering onto the track and getting run over by trains. And I don't know if you can see, try my pointer. Right about in there, you can see some white posts that appeared across the tracks. But in fact, that is an underpass for cattle that the railroad built to enable, when the railroad was built, it bisected farms. So there had to be a way for the cattle to get from one side of the railroad to the other. So even today in Weston with the rail trail, there are 4 remaining cattle passes in Weston and 1 in Wayland. They're not marked. We hope that eventually they'll be marked with signs, but as you go over the rail trail today, you'd never know that these were cattle passes. You also notice the telegraph poles on the left side, which were built by the railroad for the purposes of railroad communication and also for Western Union to transmit messages commercially by telegraph. There were no telephones back then, so the telegraph was the way to communicate. In May 1883, the Massachusetts Central Railroad went bankrupt. And one of their problems was that they tried to build the railroad all the way across the state at the same time, rather than to concentrate on the portions of lines that could be opened and generate some revenue. And part of the reason for that was that individual cities and towns could subscribe to stock in the railroad, up to 5% of their assessed valuation. So there was pressure by the towns west of Jefferson's and Sudbury to build. They wanted to see some results. So they wanted to see some grading. So the Mass Central went bankrupt from 1883 May to September 1885. No trains ran on the line. In 1885, the Massachusetts Central Railroad was reorganized financially as the Central Massachusetts Railroad. And with backing from the Boston and Lowell Railroad. So in 1887, trains resumed running. And the same year, 1887, the Boston and Lowell Railroad was leased by the Boston and Maine Railroad. And the Central Mass became the Central Mass branch of the Boston and Maine Railroad. There were various schemes to open the railroad to Hoosick Tunnel and to other places in Massachusetts. The only vision that really materialized was a connection at Northampton via the Poughkeepsie Bridge in Poughkeepsie, New York. That enabled trains to operate over the Central Mass and then connect with 6 other railroads to operate trains between Boston and Philadelphia and Washington and Harrisburg. So these were, one was an overnight train, another was a day train. And these trains ran for a very short period from 1890 to 1893. This is a schedule from 1891, just showing westbound trains, 11 westbound trains. And the express train didn't even stop at Wayland. First leaving Boston, the first stop was South Sudbury. So again, in 1891, this was 10 years after the railroad operated. There were a total of 22 passenger trains and 8 scheduled freight trains, for a total of 30 trains per day running through Wayland. So this was a very busy single track railroad line. In the year 1900, the Boston and Maine Railroad leased the Fitchburg Railroad, which is shown in red, and the Central Mass, which is shown in yellow, was kind of downgraded and became more of a branch line because the Fitchburg line had better connections to the west. Although the Central Mass still had a lot of freight traffic and passenger traffic on it. Here's a picture from 1933 taken at Wayland. And you notice the signal on Wayland Depot. That is called a train order signal. And thanks to funding from the Community Preservation Act, the town of Wayland, and work by Ben Keefe and Steve Vitello, who are both retired members of the Town of Wayland Facilities Department. The train order signal was restored last year on Wayland Depot. The wooden post was still there, but didn't have a signal on it. So it took a lot of work and a lot of time to obtain the original parts. Some parts had to be made by a blacksmith and a foundry, but the signal was restored on Wayland Depot. This is a enlargement showing so this wasn't like a traffic signal telling trains stop and go. The purpose of this signal was to tell the crews of passing trains that they had to stop and pick up what were called train orders, which were special instructions. Most trains ran according to the timetable, but if a train got delayed, or if there was an extra train that wasn't in the timetable, there had to be a way of communicating that information to the train crews to avoid collisions. So you can see in this train order on the right side, which was issued by Charlie Cole. This is one of the items that I got from Charlie Cole. The passenger train number 3112 was to meet an extra freight train westbound at Wayland. So the extra train wasn't in the timetable. So it was very important that the train crews receive these messages to avoid a collision. Speaking of collisions, there were several bad train wrecks in Wayland. Neither of them were caused by failure to receive or obey train orders. In both cases, they were due to open switches, track switches, which you can see in the foreground right here. In this particular case in 1902, an early morning freight train eastbound ran through the switch, which was misaligned for some reason, and smashed into freight cars that were parked on the freight house siding. And 2 men were killed. And the fireman jumped and avoided, he was injured, but he survived the wreck. A couple of years later, there was another wreck. There was a westbound freight train that was parked on the siding west of Wayland Depot, and an eastbound passenger train in the afternoon came along, and again, for some reason unknown, the track switch was misaligned, and the passenger train eastbound ran into the siding and smashed head-on into the freight train, killing the engineer of the passenger train and a passenger. Wayland Engine House was built in 1887. Most trains continued on west of Wayland, but in 1887, the railroad established a terminus, an engine terminal in Wayland. so that several trains a day could begin and end their commuter runs in Wayland. So there had to be a way for engines to turn around and to be stored overnight. So this is the engine house in Wayland. It was 3 stalls. And this is the only picture that I have found showing an engine on the turntable in Wayland.
Wow.
And again, this is another picture that I was fortunate to get from Charlie Cole. The Historical Society also received some items from Charlie Cole and his family, but this is one thing that I was able to get. Tom Linehan was the fireman. Wayland also had a water tank for providing engines for the tenders of the steam locomotives. A picture showing Wayland Depot and the engine house in the background. And this is the only picture that I have found that shows that small building at the extreme right, which was a milk house. And farmers from the area would bring milk cans to the milk house in the morning, which would be picked up by the passenger train for transportation to Boston. This is not Wayland, this is rural New Hampshire, but it gives you a better idea of the milk house with the milk cans on the platform that were transported to market. And then the train the following day would return the empty milk cans. Wayland Depot again, and showing the town hall and the depot. And can you see the what looks like a steel frame on this side of the depot? Get this to work right in here. It's kind of hard to see in this picture, but you can see another one in this view of Weston. Over here on the left side is another mail crane. So this, there would be a mail bag that would be hung from the crane to be picked up by the mail car. It wasn't a mail train, it was a railway post office car on the passenger train. And at the right is a cancellation. So it was actually a railway post office car where they picked up mail, delivered mail, and sorted mail on board the train while it was in motion between Boston and Northampton. And the cancellation, there was a distinctive cancellation, Boston and Northampton RPO, Railway Post Office, with the date and the train number. So not only milk, but mail was carried by the railroad. This is Weston Station before the overpass was built in Weston. I'll show another picture a little later showing the overpass. Tower Hill was the other station in Wayland on Plain Road. Tower Hill for most trains was a flag stop, and you can see the signal in the middle of the picture. And when the blade was aligned parallel to the tracks, that was the signal to the engineer that there were no passengers that were wanting to board the train, so the train could keep on rolling down the hill. If the blade was perpendicular to the tracks, or if there was a passenger on the train that had indicated to the conductor that they wanted to get off at this station, the conductor would signal to the engineer to make the stop. And even today, on the MBTA commuter rail line, there are some trains that have a little F symbol for flag stop. So that is something that even continues today. So this is a section that I call along the line of stations and other scenes between Boston and Northampton. I'm not going to show all of the stations. I'm just going to give you a sampling. of stations and important locations along the line. Waltham had 2 stations. And Waltham North, the station on the left, which was called Waltham at this time, was where the Waltham Fire and Police Station is now on Lexington Street. Does anybody know where that is? The building is gone. The building on the right was the other station in Waltham called Waltham Highlands at Hammond Street. And that building is still there. It's a real estate office, it's insurance. Regan Insurance has preserved the building and actually built a part addition onto the west side of the building. This shows the 2 basic architectural styles of the stations that were common along the Central Mass line. The picture on the left is kind of similar to Wayland and Weston. The building on the right was similar to Tower Hill and some other stations along the line. So the railroad kind of alternated. This is a kind of a faded postcard showing Weston Station after the overpass was built. It was a dangerous crossing of the railroad and the highway there. So Church Street was separated from the railroad with an overpass. And actually the Weston Station was moved a little bit easterly to make way for building the overpass. South Sudbury, this is the Union Station at South Sudbury at the crossing of the Central Mass line and the New Haven Railroad, which was originally the Framingham Lowell Railroad. We know when the station was built, 1888. We're not exactly sure when it was torn down. We think it was maybe about 1954 or 55, but if anybody out there can find the date that that building was torn down, I'd really like to know. Before the building was torn down, the railroad built a small building just east of the old station, which is still there. And I believe that's one of the buildings that the town of Sudbury is trying to acquire from the MBTA. Continuing west, Wayside Inn had a very small shelter on Dutton Road, which then was a very rural dirt road. And behind the building in the picture at the left is another milk house. Continuing west, Hudson. There were several stations in Hudson. Steve mentioned the Fitchburg Railroad, which had its own Hudson Station. This was the Hudson Station on the Central Mass. I suppose it could get confusing if you were in Boston and told the ticket agent you wanted a ticket for Hudson, because there were 2 stations in Hudson, both with the same name. The building behind the engine today is still there, but you would not recognize it because it's been completely remodeled into an office building. In Clinton, in order to make way for the construction of the Wachusett Reservoir from 1902 to 1903, several miles of the Central Mass were relocated. And the original alignment was flooded by the reservoir, Wachusett Reservoir. And the state built a tunnel and paid for the construction of a viaduct, long viaduct. So if you were going west on the train, as soon as you came out of this tunnel, which was about 1,000 feet long, you would immediately go across the long bridge. So it must have been a spectacular ride. Continuing west, Jefferson, which was the original end of the Mass Central line, had a station that was very similar to Wayland. A few differences, but very similar in architecture. You can see that in the roof, there is a patch in the roof. So this is when the train order signal was installed at the station along the line about 1910. And so that serves to date the photograph. And this is a postcard. I don't know if you can read the inscription, but it says, "When you come to see me, this is where you will land. Immense station." Continuing west, town of Rutland, which is pretty much in the center of the state geographically. And also it's near the summit of the high point of the railroad. So there was a rock cut. It was about a mile away from the actual summit. So when the railroad was built, it required blasting this rock cut. There was another high bridge in Bonsville, which is a village in the town of Palmer, that crossed over the Swift River and the Boston and Albany Railroad Athol branch. And this is a picture from the Central Mass book that was published by the B&M Railroad Historical Society. Amherst had a station and a freight house. Not all stations, by the way, had a train order signal. Only the more important stations where there was a siding, where trains could meet or pass one another. So, and the stations that had a train order signal had an agent telegrapher, where the other stations just had an agent that could sell tickets, didn't need to know how to operate the telegraph. And finally, at the end of the line was Northampton on the other side of the long bridge over the Connecticut River. The bridge was built in 1887 and is still there today, used by the rail trail. The station was actually not built by the Central Mass. It was on the Connecticut River line, but it was another Union station that served trains on the Connecticut River line, or what became the B&M and the Central Mass. So starting about the time of World War I, there was a slow decline of the railroad that passed through Wayland. About the time of World War I, the engine terminal was discontinued in Wayland. Throughout the 1920s, with increased use of automobiles and trucks, that hurt the railroad's business. The station agents' jobs were eliminated at various places along the way. Crossing tenders that had cranked down the gates were replaced with automatic crossing signals. The Wayland water tank was torn down about 1934. The engine house in 1936. And in 1938, the great New England hurricane of September 21st really caused a lot of devastation on the Central Mass line. The last passenger train had already, through passenger train between Boston and Northampton, had run in 1932. So it was 6 years later when the hurricane really cut the railroad line in two sections. This is a picture showing Wayland, the engine house in Wayland, about the time it was torn down. After World War I, the railroad stopped using the engine house and a lumber company used the building. And you can see that the turntable in the right had already been filled in. and the steel frame had been scrapped by the railroad.
Is that the same turntable that you can see now, right near the depot, just west of the depot on the right there?
Exactly. It was a 50-foot diameter turntable that we excavated with volunteers as part of the Wayland Historical Commission's work to preserve the railroad. Because I don't think anybody here remembers the crossing at Russell's when there was a steel barrier that came out of the pavement. And it was guarded by a traffic light that you can barely see in this reproduction from the manufacturer of the signal, Evans Products. And there was only one other location on the Boston and Maine where this type of a crossing barrier was installed. And in both cases, it was because the crossing was at an angle and it was hard for motorists to see trains without craning their neck. So this was installed about 1936 and discontinued in the early 1950s and replaced with a more conventional type of crossing barrier. And in the picture at right, the white building is one of the early buildings that it's now Russell's Garden Center. I don't think the building is there anymore. An image of Wayland Station with the first morning commuter train that was still being hauled by steam locomotives. Wayland Station, in 1949, the agent's job was eliminated, but the railroad was required by the Mass Department of Public Utilities to keep the building open as a shelter. So although there was no agent there, the building was open. And you see the green box on the left side of the picture. That was for coal. And the railroad supplied coal, which the commuters could then use to fire the stove in the picture at the right, which was taken either before or during when the Wayland Depot building was renovated. After it was purchased by the town.
You're fading a little bit there.
Microphone is fading, okay.
Keep your microphone up, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So that was a photo that was actually published in the Boston Globe. Probably the photographer came by while the building was being renovated and thought it was a quaint picture. And the stove was later moved. The stove is still in the building. It's been moved. But commuters could actually, in the winter, build a fire in the stove with coal to keep warm until the train arrived. And there were three commuter trains to Boston until about 1958, when it was cut back to 2 and then 1959 to 1 train. The last use of steam locomotives was in 1956, but they were kind of phased in. This is a picture from 1955 and taken from what was then probably Raytheon that was then under construction. The town hall old town hall appears in the left, and about the only thing remaining in this picture are the steel transmission towers. All the other buildings, you can see the steeple of St. Anne's Church, which is where the post office is now. When I was in high school, passenger trains used rail diesel cars, or RDCs, which were built by the Bud Company in Philadelphia. So the nickname Budliner was used for the Boston and Maine Railroad's fleet of self-propelled rail diesel cars, which by the late 50s had replaced all of the conventional locomotive hauled passenger trains. And 1969, this is a schedule. When I was in high school, there was one train a day, one passenger train a day between Boston and South Sudbury, stopping at Wayland and Tower Hill and stations along the way. It took anywhere from 35 minutes to 43 minutes each way. And the fare was $1.15, unless you bought a booklet, which was a discounted commuter ticket. In the late 60s, 1970, the condition of the track had deteriorated. There was only one train a day. And the MBTA, which subsidized the commuter rail service, decided to discontinue the train through Wayland and South Sudbury. But the commuters protested, and they frequently, around the end of June, when the state budget was due to be enacted, people would contact their legislator and urge the MBTA to continue the passenger train. And finally, in 1971, the MBTA said, we've had enough, we're going to discontinue the train. But a bunch of people in town protested and encouraged the MBTA. They said that if you add several trains, it will increase the ridership and reduce the operating cost. So from October to November of 1971, there were some additional trains that were added, commuter trains.
Yeah, Rick, in October of 1971, we had just come back from an overseas assignment. Tanya was with her family and our children out in Ohio, and in October of 1971, I took the train out to see a real estate agent, the Wagners, Ralph and Elaine Wagner, who some people may know.
This is a good story. You want to use the microphone?
Okay. Well, just in October 1971, had come back from an overseas assignment, and we were just moving to Wayland. I need it closer. And so I took the train out. Tanya was in Ohio with our children, and to see realtors, Ralph and Elaine Wagner at Holmes Associates, which was on Route 20. So I took the train out. We moved here on November 4th, 1971, and the train stopped. That was it. Yeah, did.
Train.
Right.
Thank you. I hope the people on Zoom could hear that. As Tom was saying, the train stopped, and the date was November 26th, 1971, just a few weeks later.
Yeah, right.
So I was home from college at the time for Thanksgiving vacation. There was an early snowstorm that year, but I rode the train from South Sudbury to Boston and back. And in Boston, on impulse, I went to the ticket window and bought a ticket, one-way ticket to Wayland, an extra ticket. And you can see the date stamped on the ticket. So I bought that as a souvenir of the last day. The top picture, the color picture, shows the train leaving South Sudbury from Union Street going east. And the bottom picture shows the train, same train, crossing the Sudbury River in Wayland. Although the passenger train stopped running then, freight trains still continued to use the line. These were some pictures I took at South Sudbury. And back in 1967, you can see that there were quite a few cars on the freight train back then, mostly building materials. The picture at the right was taken on the diamond crossing of the two railroads. You can't see the crossing, but the engine is right sitting on the crossing going west. These were some of the companies that were freight customers along the Central Mass line. All of the freight was inbound. There were no companies that actually shipped out anything on the Central Mass. It was all inbound loads, mostly building materials. And exception was Watertown Dairy, which received boxcars of feed for cattle. That was in bags, in boxcars, and the Watertown Dairy truck would back up to the boxcar at what's now the Wayland Library upper parking lot and unload the bags of feed into the truck to take to Watertown Dairy. That was the last freight customer in Wayland. Of course, most of you remember Ogilvy's in Weston, which had a siding. Lindy Gas Products, you know where the Herb Chambers Mercedes is now on Route 20. Before that was Bossy Sports. And before Bossy Sports was the Lindy plant, where they received cars of pressurized gas for industrial operations. There were several lumber companies along the line. The one, Mullen Lumber in South Sudbury, was a regular customer until the very end. And I suppose during the 50s and 60s, there were still a lot of houses that were being built. So that added to the freight traffic from the railroad. So as we've seen, the last commuter train was in 1971. In 1975, the MBTA, using federal money, purchased a bunch of railroad lines from the Boston and Maine Railroad, which was then in bankruptcy. And the federal money helped the Boston and Maine Railroad during the period that they were in bankruptcy. The last freight train ran through Wayland in the summer of 1980. The rails were paved over, and in 2010, the MBTA leased a corridor within that 5 rods right of way that the railroad had purchased for a rail trip between Wayland and Waltham and the town of Berlin out near Interstate 495 for a rail trail. At that time, the DCR, the Mass Department of Conservation and Recreation, didn't have the money to build any rail trails. So the first portion of the east end of the Central Mass was built by the town of Wayland using Community Preservation Act money to build part of the rail trail between Old Sudbury Road and Route 20. And that's the stone dust portion of the rail trail that's open today. East of the library in Wayland, Old Sudbury, Concord Road, Eversource decided to build an improved way of accessing the transmission lines that follow along the railroad. And so they offered to remove the rails and build a gravel access road at no cost to the town. And then the Mass Department of Conservation and Recreation, DCR, agreed to pave the trail after the access road was built. And so that was built in Wayland and Weston to the Waltham town line. And it was opened in 2019, the formal opening of that portion of the railroad. Yep.
Could you go back to that previous slide where you had all the Stanmore lumber used to be where the Herb Chambers was when we moved here, because my next door neighbor used to work for them.
Stanmore was actually across the street where the nursing home is now. What's
Yeah,
it
that
called?
was where Old Country
Where
Road
Old
comes
County
out.
Road comes in. Yeah, and that was a big lumber company.
Yeah. it
They
was.
didn't have a siding on that side of Route 20. They had to unload from the south side into trucks and then haul it across the road. But that was a big lumber
Yes, it
company
was.
there.
So Rick, I have a little side story. So I
Yeah,
don't know if you noticed the hat I'm wearing tonight.
let me give you the microphone so that I hope the people on Zoom can hear these stories. Does this microphone work for the Zoom people?
Yes. It won't go that far though. It's okay, they'll hear.
So Rick, anyways,
Okay,
It's okay.
so I used to work for Precourt and Son over in Sudbury, and South Sudbury had a building stone company. But a good friend of mine who worked for them, Lars Ullman, who grew up at the corner of Old Sudbury Road and Gleason Lane as a young guy in the early sixties. Stanmar's shipments couldn't get unloaded. Lindy wouldn't let Stanmar use their siding. So they would come up to South Sudbury where Mullen used to unload, and they'd hire Charlie Precourt's trucks to load up. So one day there's a thunderstorm coming and they got a load of plywood, and the boss is going, "Yeah, hurry up." So they had a 42-foot Fruhoff trailer, and they put a whole box car of plywood on it. The net weight of just the cargo was 120,000 pounds. It was way overweight. And they
Wow.
made their way down to the post road and headed down to Stanmar. And I think they took out about 10 telephone services on the way. And then Mr. Precourt said, "Next time, why don't we stay 1 or 2 lifts lower?" And I'm gonna get you a copy of that photo because I think you'd enjoy that.
well, do you know where Buddy Dog is on
Yeah.
Route 20? There was a siding that might have been built after that or before that, or maybe it wasn't in use when you.
So the period I'm talking about would be early 60s.
Okay, well, there was a siding there in the late 1960s that went right alongside where Buddy Dog is. And who knows, it might even still be there in the weeds today. But for a long time, people were joking that here was Buddy Dog that had a railroad siding next to it.
He brought the dog food.
So thank you for that story. Shell Oil actually had a tank farm. Does anybody remember the tank farm? Which is where Jones Road is now. There's a big office development.
Oh, that was
in there.
Esso.
Esso, well.
Shell Oil was down by Bentley.
Okay, well. I know there was a pipeline that followed the railroad in places through Weston. And it was marked Shell, so maybe,
You are right. Shell
maybe-
Oil did have the pipeline,
okay,
but the terminal that was down at the bottom of Jones Road was an Esso plant.
okay. Good to know. So. The rail trail. Was built in sections and is still under construction in places. This is a map that was part of a PowerPoint presentation from a 25% design public hearing in March 2023 by Mass DOT and DCR that described the portion of the trail that they were proposing to build at that time, which is the yellow section, which would be from basically they will pave the town portion of the trail, which is stone dust, between Old Sudbury Road and Route 20. They will pave that, and then they will tear up the tracks west of Route 20 at Russell's and across the Sudbury River and build the portion of the rail trail to near Landham Road in East Sudbury. So the green east of there is the Eversource Access Road and DCR Trail that goes through Wayland and Weston. The blue line at the right is the portion of the trail that the city of Waltham has been building for the last couple of years. And I don't think it's been opened, although people are using it anyway. Going to the west, the long, straight blue line, which now that you mention it, you can see an angle that it does go kind of northwest
Yeah.
to get to Hudson. That is the Eversource has buried power lines underneath the Central Mass line. They tore up the tracks. This was a very controversial project in Sudbury, but it went through courts and the MBTA was allowed to lease the right of way to Eversource for use as an underground power line, which has been completed between near Landham Road in East Sudbury and Wilkins Street in Hudson, which is on the east side of Hudson. So the power line has been buried and bids have been opened by DCR just recently to construct a rail trail, paving the access road that Eversource built.
How's the rail trail gonna get across 20 and across the Sudbury River?
Route 20 in South Sudbury
No, right at the Sudbury River, you know,
Okay.
where,
in Wayland,
where it stops now,
okay?
right? Then in order to continue, it has to get over to the bridge.
Yeah, at Russell's, that's right at Russell's Crossing.
So is there gonna be an overpass or how are they gonna do that?
There is currently a traffic light for traffic coming out of
Yeah.
The Newtown Center
Yeah.
and Russell's Garden Center.
Yeah.
That will be relocated to the west side of the intersection. And they will build a new crosswalk with a pedestrian button there.
Okay.
That's from the plans that I have seen.
So that the rail trail will cross 20 with a cross light, with a
With a
light.
traffic light. That will be a relocated traffic light just west of the intersection where there's currently a traffic light.
Then they have to figure out the bridge.
The crossing of Sudbury River, that's a wooden trestle.
Yeah.
Which has been inspected by engineers. And although it needs some repair work, some of the wooden pilings evidently need to be replaced because they're kind of hollowed out. But from my understanding, most of those wooden pilings can be reused. And
Carried trains not too long ago, they can carry a bunch of bikes pretty easily, I think.
Yep.
Yeah.
right. And also, it needs to be strong enough for emergency vehicles
Oh.
and probably for Eversource access vehicles in case the transmission lines needed work. So, so that was the question, how is the rail trail going to cross Route 20 at Wayland? Continuing on, there is a vision to extend the rail trail all the way between Boston and Northampton. And there is an organization by the name of Norwatic Network located in Northampton. Greg Della Penna is the principal guy. And it's really a network of organizations that are in the process of building portions of the rail trail in different parts of the state. Some portions have already been built. Other parts are under construction. I mentioned the portion in Waltham that's being built by the city of Waltham. Eversource and DCR are building portions. At the west end, the name Norwatic comes from the Norwatic Rail Trail, which was built by DCR and a predecessor state agency between Northampton and Amherst. And there actually was a station on the railroad called Norwottuck in South Amherst. It was originally called South Amherst. It was named Norwottuck, which is an Indian name for that area. And then there's a portion in the town of, I believe, Hardwick, New Braintree, that was built by a land trust. And there's an organization called Wachusett Greenways that has built and opened portions of the trail in the towns of West Boylston, Holden, Rutland, and I think Barry. So this is a vision to complete the vision, the original vision of the Mass Central Railroad between Boston and Northampton. For further information, if you're interested, there is a book called The Central Mass. In the interest of full disclosure, I was one of the members of the book committee for the Boston and Maine Railroad Historical Society that originally published the first edition of the Central Mass. Steve here has a copy. In 2008, the B&M Railroad Historical Society, with an agreement by Marker Press, reprinted the book, which had long been out of print, and expanded, updated the book with a supplement, included an index and an updating of the history of the railroad between 1975 and 2008. And copies of that book are still in print. The Wayland Depot sells copies. The Wayland Depot might be closed. The Wayland Library has a copy in the local history section, which is in reference, but I don't believe it's a circulating copy. So, and another book that was written by a fellow by the name of J.R. Green that just covers the original Mass Central Railroad between the 1860s and 1885, which goes into a great deal of detail about the building of the railroad using newspaper accounts and pretty detailed information. So if you're interested in the early history of the railroad, that's a book that is, I saw J.R. Green about a month ago, and he has a few copies still left for sale. And currently, there is an exhibit at the Wayland Library, thanks to MJ. And it's on the main floor of the library, near the reference desk. It will be there through February, but due to construction in the library, I understand the library will be closed for the next couple of days.
Tomorrow and next day.
Okay, so it will be reopening on Friday. And so, and thereafter, so if anybody is interested in seeing some Wayland Railroadiana, as MJ mentioned.
Microphone.
Okay, if anyone's interested in seeing this exhibit, it will be there to the end of February. Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions? Is there a way that the questioners might use the microphone so that
It's
people-
okay.
Rick, I don't need the mic. Can you
Okay.
tell people about World War II? And our grand, what a activity that was.
Okay, if anybody knows where the Assabet River National Wildlife Refuge is on Hudson Road, during World War II, there was a critical need for the Army to store ammunition. And it had to be stored away from the Atlantic Ocean so that it couldn't be in danger of German U-boats. And so in 1942, the Army seized land in the towns of Stowe, Sudbury, and Maynard for an ammunition depot. And it was done very quickly during the war. The landowners were told, basically, you have 3 weeks to move. And the reason for that location was because of the proximity to the railroad. And that's how the ammunition was moved in and out on the railroad, on ammunition trains. When the ammunition was moved out, it went to South Boston and was loaded onto ships and was probably a critical part of the D-Day invasion. And the Army built a number of ammunition depots near the coast, and there were ammunition trains that ran through Wayland, Sudbury, to transport ammunition. I'm told that the ammunition did not have the fuses installed, so it wasn't in danger of exploding in these long ammunition trains. I'm not an explosive expert, but that lasted for several years during World War II.
There is a book about that called, I believe, The Ammo Dump, that has
Yes.
been published within the last year or so.
Yes.
And you can actually, from time to time, take tours where you can see inside at least one of the remaining buildings that were largely underground where the ammunition was stored.
There were a number of ammunition bunkers, and those
Yes.
are still there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
A question online. In 1868, what was the industrial reasoning for wanting a railroad from only Sudbury to Weston?
The question was, in 1868, what was the industrial reason for the railroad starting in Weston? Is that correct? In Wayland and Sudbury, they weren't anxious to build an expensive railroad line all the way into Boston. So they figured if they could connect with an existing railroad called the Fitchburg Railroad, it would save a lot of expense. So that was the idea between the Wayland and Sudbury branch and the Mass Central. But when the Mass Central proposed to build west of Sudbury, the Fitchburg Railroad didn't really want any part of a branch line that would be in competition with them. So that spurred the idea to extend the railroad to a connection with the Boston and Lowell at a point called North Cambridge, where the Boston and Lowell Railroad already had an existing line that connected with the railroad line to Arlington and Lexington.
About the ammunition trains, Royce Kaler, who I knew, he died at about 96 or 97 a few years ago. His house ran along that railroad that carried the trains. And he said, we always knew when there was a train going through because we lost our power. They shut down everybody's electricity while the train was going through. So I thought that was interesting.
Yep. Well, it was a high security
Yeah.
thing. And one of the reasons why there were so few pictures taken of the ammunition trains, there's one in the Central Mass book that was taken in Belmont, but on the curve in Belmont, but obviously it was high security, and anyone trying to take a picture of an ammunition train would probably be arrested and thought to be a spy. Other questions?
Was there any effort to help preserve the Weston Station?
Good question. Weston Station is privately owned. When the railroad sold the building to a private individual in the early 1950s, they sold the building, but they kept the land. So through the owners of the building, there's been a disconnect. The land is still owned by the MBTA. And my understanding is through a quirk of law, the assessment of the town of Weston is based on the value of the building and the land, even though the owner doesn't own the land. And it's my understanding that there's some back taxes and back rent that have precluded the present day owner. It's gone, the building has gone through several owners from doing any work to preserve the building. A couple of years ago, the building was designated as one of the most endangered historic resources in Massachusetts. There are many people in Weston that are trying to save the building, but it's tied up in a kind of a legal morass. So the building just deteriorates, and I suppose it's called demolition by neglect.
I think I recall a special wedding train powered by a steam locomotive running through Wayland.
Yep.
When was that?
That was.
That was in 1973. And my previous presentation, I included some pictures. I didn't include it this time because I wanted to make this a shorter presentation. But that was a special train with a steam locomotive that was brought down from Steamtown, which was then located in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And the actual wedding took place in the town of Holliston. And after the wedding, there's a section on this in the Central Mass book. People were bused from Holliston to Wayland to board this special train, which went west from Wayland to Hudson as kind of a rolling reception line for guests of the wedding. And then when the train reached Hudson, actually Gleasondale, which is Chestnut Street in Hudson, the bus that had carried, or buses that had carried people from Holliston to Wayland met the train, and the formal reception was at the Sheraton Tara on Route 9 near the Mass Turnpike. So it was a very expensive event for the family.
They're still married.
You mentioned a train from Weston to Ayr. What towns would that one go through?
Train from Weston to Ayr. That would be the present day MBTA Fitchburg commuter rail line, which goes through Waltham, Weston, Kendall Green, Lincoln, Concord, West Concord, South Acton onto Fitchburg. And that's the original Fitchburg Railroad route. Yes.
I just, when I'm listening to you, so we're actually sort of the butters to this. I live right by where Tower Station would have been. And I just can't help thinking for everybody in this room, if you ever, I go to Boston every day, I'm spending an hour and a half. How great it would be to flag down that train. You know, it'd be so great. I love the rail trail, but sometimes I think we've lost it.
And particularly getting out of Plain Road onto Route 20 up the hill, that's a bad intersection. So I sympathize with you. But there were a number of commuters that commuted from Tower Hill Station until the very end, probably 6 or 8. And you might remember the small shelter that was there in later years.
We had a librarian who commuted from Boston to Wayland, on the train every day.
Good.
The problem with maintaining rail service for commuters on this line is essentially that it was single track. And that really cuts down on the capacity. And it's still possible to take a short ride to one of the nearer stations on the Fitchburg route or on the former Boston and Albany main line that runs through Framingham and Natick and commute that way. And those lines are and have for a long time been double track. And they have much more capacity than the Central Massachusetts ever has. Wayland had some very effective, a series of very effective Republican Congresswomen. But the last one that they had, Hasty Evans, I think did not appreciate the problems that the limited capacity of the single track Central Massachusetts route had.
When Hasty Evans was the state representative from Wayland, she was trying to get a commuter rail line built using the Central Mass. But there was a complete lack of community support, and in fact, a lot of community opposition in Wayland and Sudbury that killed that proposal. There was a study for the Metropolitan Area Planning Council tried for a busway, dedicated busway, and that also faced a lot of opposition. So people seem to want a rail trail. So that's what's being built, a rail trail. Yes.
I know this might be outside the purview, because it wasn't quite discussed, but with the invention of kind of barcodes on freight trains and car tracks being invented by a Wayland resident, was that tracking system for freight used in Wayland, or was it mostly the Lowell line, if you know what I'm talking about, for the car tracks tracking system?
Well, the only thing I'm familiar with was called automatic car identification. And I can remember on the B&M Bud cars, they had these colored panels
Yes.
with stripes. And the railroads, it was also used for freight cars. And it was an early application of barcodes to try to track railroad cars throughout the United States. I don't know which company developed it, and
I
I'm
think
not.
I think it was car tracking. It was from Wayland. One of the inventors was from Wayland, but I was curious if it was used on that line or it was, because I know it was like tested on other lines.
Yeah, well, I do remember distinctly that the B&M Bud cars, when I was in high school, had those colored ACI, it was called automatic car identification barcodes on them.
Those were used largely on freight cars, and for at least a decade or so, most freight cars had them.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the inventor, but I would like to know more about the name of the inventor.
So Rick, I think we should just take one more question and then be done. It's 10 of 9, so.
All right, yes.
You have a hop freight car in Wayland?
No, I never hopped a freight car. However, I did get a ride on a freight train. Back about 1970, I was out in South Sudbury and the local freight train came along. So I had my camera and I was taking a few pictures and I talked to one of the members of the crew. I said, where are you going today? He said, Marlboro. So on impulse, I asked him, is there any chance I could get a ride? So he said, well, you need to talk to the conductor, whose name I found out was Joe Mosca, who was the longtime freight conductor on the railroad. So I went up to Joe and I said, any chance I could get a ride? So he said, you want to ride in the engine or the caboose? So I said, well, I'd like to ride on the engine going out and the caboose coming back. So I got a ride between South Sudbury and Marlboro on the freight train. On the way back, the freight train stopped in Hudson for dinner at a place called The Bar. And I don't know if they imbibed in alcohol, but I was not of the age, so I stayed on the caboose. All the time they were eating their dinner. And then they came along and started up the train again, and it took me to Wayland, right near the road where I live. And they stopped the train and let me off the caboose there, and I walked home.